Welcome. Welcome to Easter. Easter week 1. I'll welcome you to Easter next week too. It's going to be a good time. Man, it's so good to be here. We're starting our brand new series, Reclaim. I'm really excited for this. And last week, we ended our Journey series. Journey, we were traveling through the Old Testament. Look, we learned new words in church. I know, Old Testament, that's a tough one. But it was awesome. We went from Garden to Egypt to Sinai to Jerusalem. Last week we went from Abraham to Moses through the judges, the kings, and the prophets. And we ended up all the way back. Do you remember where we ended? Babylon. We ended up to Babylon, all the way back into slavery in a foreign land. In fact, and we talked about how the Old Testament equates to many things, but a couple things are certain. One, it didn't work, right? All the sacrifices, all the prophets, all the kings, all the judges, all the many lists of decrees from Egypt to Sinai to Jerusalem led us all the way full circle back to Babylon. In other words, all of our attempts failed, and they failed pretty miserably, right? But through the process, the hopeful thing, the redeeming piece that we found is that one of the overarching narratives of the Old Testament is not that we find a God that condemns, but that we find a God that contends for us in the midst of our mess. That's really good news, right? That's awesome. That's the Old Testament God. We finished last week talking about how the Old Testament ends with the Israelites. They're crying out for a new deliverer, a new Joshua, a new Adam, a new Moses. They're hoping for a new person to come in, something that will actually work. And in fact, when we pick up in the New Testament, we find out that roughly for 490 years, the Israelites have been living in heavy oppression. Their oppressors simply shifted from Babylon, then to Persia, then to Rome, exactly. Babylon, Persia, Rome. So when you turn the page from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you are actually fast-forwarding roughly 500 to 600 years in human history. You're not just turning a page and the next year starts. You're going from 500 to 600 years. But before we push that button, before we turn that page, I want to go all the way back. I want to talk about 2 quick stories all the way back at the very beginning. And a couple things to remember before I tell these 2 opening stories is that the beginning of the Bible is illustrating to people what God is like. In many ways, it's our introduction class to God, right? It's like, who is God? Here he is. Here's your intro. Here's your 101 course. And it's really important that you know that Genesis is a there and then book. In fact, I will call most of the Bible, they are there and then books. What does that mean? That means when they were written to people there and then. And in order to really learn from it and apply it to our here and now, what's really important is to go back in time as much as we can and reread some of the context, we read some of the stories through the lens of what they would have been looking at there and then, and that makes it more applicable to here and now. It's a word called context, or if you're in seminary, it's called exegete, or exegeting, or exegesis. But the stories are told and written for a culture that was there and then. So, for example, what we need to know about Genesis, before you open the book of Genesis, there was a there and then people. Most of those people served God. Some of the most popular gods in Scripture that are written about are Baal, Ashtoreth, and Asherah. That's just to name a few. There's a bunch more, but Baal, Ashtoreth, and Asherah are some of the most popular ones. Every single one of those gods, Baal, Ashtoreth, and Asherah, do you know what they were doing? They were requiring major sacrifices in order for them to give you anything. I mean, just if you wanted good crops, you go pray to Baal, Ashtoreth, and Asherah. You wouldn't just pray to them, you would sacrifice something to them. If you wanted good rain for your crops, it was believed in those days that you would have to oftentimes kill an animal. And if you killed that animal and you got good crops that year, that meant Baal liked your sacrifice, and all you need to do the next year, what do you do now? It comes next year, you sacrificed an animal to Baal, you got good crops, meaning the rain came, the crops grew, you got good crops, what do? You pony up again next year, quite literally. Okay, pause to let people catch up, okay? And then you pony up again. But if you didn't yield a good crop, the rains did not come, the crops did not grow, what did that mean? Baal did not like your sacrifice. And so, if you really wanted good crops, because that's how you and your family eat, what do you do the following year? Sacrifice more. You do a little bit more. Pony up a little more, 2 ponies this time, 3 ponies. And it was oftentimes, in order to appease the gods and get a good crop, people would sacrifice more and more each year. In fact, they would sacrifice more and more until they felt like they got a good crop. And a lot of times they would go all the way up until even child sacrifice. If they felt like they had to sacrifice one of their children to get a good crop, that's how child sacrifice really entered into our world. In fact, in order to serve Baal, Ashtoreth, and Asherah, prostitution rituals and child sacrifice became very commonplace. And here's what you need to know. The gods, up until this point in time in the world there and then, were viewed as cold, unrelenting, distant, detached, bad-tempered, and requiring just about your everything just in order for you to survive. So, when you open up the book of Genesis, and what do we find? We find our first introduction to our God, and according to the day, it should start with him saying something along the lines of, hey, build a huge statue in my honor. It should start with something about, hey, sacrifice. Come, and this is how you're going to be, sacrifice this, sacrifice that. It should start with him demanding more from humanity in some way, shape, or form. But instead, this story starts with a God, and he is building a garden. This is so different. This is so wild. And not only is he building a garden, he says the garden is for you. You haven't paid a sacrifice yet. You haven't prayed to him yet. You're actually not even meeting him. He's coming to meet you. He's doing something for your behalf on your good, or for your goodness on your behalf, and you've done nothing yet to deserve it. You haven't done anything to possess it. He just made it for us. To anyone hearing the story back then and there, they would have been immediately intrigued, and they would have noticed, like, wow, there are some major differences going on between this God and all these other gods we've been hearing about. But he doesn't even end there. This is crazy. Not only does this God decide to build a garden, this God decides to build his prized creation out of dirt. Whoops. He creates out of dirt. His prized creation, like the best thing he could think of. He's like, do you know what I'm going to start with? Dirt. What are all the other gods are in gold, ivory statues, and you have to come serve them, and you have to come sacrifice them, and this God's playing with dirt, which is a really good thing we find out, actually, right? Why do we find out? Why do we think that's a really good thing? Because this creation that he's made out of dirt, we find out really quick, is really good at making messes. For those of you who haven't figured this out yet, that's you. He's not afraid to get mess. And his creation, this dirt creation, becomes really good at making messes. Remember, we were meant to live in day 7 forever and ever and ever. Remember, we do not last long. In fact, we're 2 pages into the story. God creates us in this beautiful garden. He creates us out of dirt. And then he says, hey, just don't eat from that one tree. Just not one tree. Just one tree. Just don't eat from the one tree. And then, right, what happens? The serpent shows up and he's like, yo. He's like, did God really say don't eat from that one tree? And Eve actually nails the answer. She's like, God really did say don't eat from that one tree. Like, hey, if Eve was going to let us off the hook forever and ever, she'd be like, actually, I'm not super sure. Like, I don't know. Maybe I heard wrong. But no, she's like, nope, God did say don't eat from that one tree. Like, ace the test. Dang it. Okay, so then the serpent's like, and then Eve says, God said not to eat from the one tree or else we'll die. And the serpent just puts in that question mark, will you certainly die? She didn't ace this test. She was like, oh, maybe not. He says, maybe you just become more like God. And then right off the bat, Genesis 3, 6-7, it says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked. Crowd gasp. No? Okay, thank you. So they sewed fig leaves together, and they made coverings for themselves. Here's the conclusion. The dirt creation is 2 pages in, and we're already making a mess. We're 2 pages in, we're making a mess. So I just want to pause on that for a second. Here it is. Who made the mess of things? Humans did. We made a mess of things. I had somebody first service that yelled out the snake, and I was like, no, blame shifter. Okay? But here's the cool part too. What is God's response in the midst of our first mess? This is at times I think we get it so wrong. Sometimes we've gotten this doctrine or this thought process where like, well, God comes in and he's angry and he's furious and he's like, what's wrong with you? You're just a bunch of dirt. Huh? You're just a bunch of, like, what are you thinking? You're so stupid. You got it wrong. How could you? And like, that is not the God that we actually get in the Genesis story. And again, if God's all-knowing, then here's the beauty of the story. Then he already knows we made a mess of things, right? And how does this God decide to enter in? Walks. It says he walks into the garden. He's walking, looking for Adam, knowing Adam and Eve already screwed up. He's not bull rushing in. He's not like, oh, gotcha. We don't have a gotcha God. We have a God who walks in and says, Adam, Eve, hey, where are you? God asks, where are you? God asks, what have you done? God does curse the evil that hurt us. God does also, you know what, this is incredible, God covers us. He's the first thing he says, he makes skin for Adam and Eve. So he actually covers us in the midst of. He also gets us out of harm's way. By the way, he talks about when we exit the garden, he tells us why we have to exit the garden. Because you've eaten from the tree of knowledge and evil, so you can't eat from the tree of life. Why? Because you'll be permanently stuck in like this. And I have an idea. I have a thought to restore. I have a thought to reclaim this situation. I have a thought to bring some grace and find a way where we can still get back to the original design. So, we got to go. That's good. Listen, there was pain. There are consequences, not curses, by the way, but there's pain and consequences added to our lives. But here's the awesome kicker. When God says, let's go, God comes with us. God came with us. He walked out of the garden with us. How do you know that? Turn the page. Genesis chapter 4. And who is he dealing with? Cain and Abel. And who's God talking to? Cain and Abel. And where are Cain and Abel not? They're not in the garden. So God came out of the garden with us to restore, to redeem, to reclaim. Oh, come on, we're preaching now. We are not removed from his presence. And here's the thing. It's not because we haven't made a mess of things. We did. It's because God is bigger than the mess. Somebody say amen right here. Come on. God's already been going from the get-go. He's like, I put it into the fabric. I knew there were going to be messes coming up. I wanted you to know I'm a God who knows how to deal with the mess. I want you to know that I'm a God that's bigger than the mess. God immediately begins to redeem, to restore, and to reclaim what was lost from the very beginning. There's some beautiful takeaways that every other God would have smitten or smoten or smoted, however you need to say it. But God, from the get-go, goes, I'm a different type of God. God does not run from the mess. God is not afraid of the mess. In fact, God walks toward the mess, and God deals with the mess. Whatever you have going on in your life, whatever type of mess you've been in before, whatever type of mess you're in right here and now, whatever type of mess that's coming around the corner that you don't even know what type of mess you're about to step into, but you know some point in life you're about to step into it, you need to know God does not run from the mess. God walks toward your mess, and God will deal with your mess. That's the type of good, loving Heavenly Father here. Now, if you're able to acknowledge your mess, a next question that would be really good to ask is this. Well, how much of the mess do I deal with? What's my part in all of this? I'm glad you asked. And again, if you go back there and then, and you ask those people, well, how would Baal, Ashtoreth, or Asherah make you deal with that? Well, you're going to have to do a prostitution ritual. You're going to have to sacrifice a child or a pony. You're going to have to pony up in some way, shape, or form. And every other person listening would have asked the same question. What is required of me? In other words, this God seems pretty cool. I like the garden thing. I like that it's not some statue of ivory or gold. I like that I don't have to sacrifice. But what do I have to do to get in on this God? What about this God? And you could say, in other words, they might be asking the question, what's the deal? What's my part? And we all know about deals, right? You make a deal, I make a deal. We make deals every single day, right? I might, if I want to buy your car, I give you money, right? If I want to go buy a candy bar, I give the cashier money. We're making deals nonstop. Sometimes most of our deals are around money for something, but we still do trade for trade deals, right? I have a hot tub. I want a four-wheeler. I might be able to put it up on Craigslist somewhere. I got a hot tub. Give me a four-wheeler. That's a real situation. Anybody has a four-wheeler? No, I'm just kidding. Trying to mix church and pleasure. Okay. If you don't hold up your part of the deal, though, for instance, church and business. If you don't hold up your part of the deal, for instance, if I was to take someone's keys to their car and I was just to take off the back door right now and I was going to leave and it was going to be 2-3 days gone, you would think I stole your car. And if you thought I stole your car, you would eventually call the cops, and the cops would come and they'd arrest me, right? Or they'd tell me I have to hold up my end of the deal, or I have to go to jail. And we have all types of deals like this, right? Even if you buy a house, what do you have to do? You have to do miles and 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 miles of paperwork. And you have to sign and sign and sign and sign and sign. And you need to sign and sign and sign and sign and sign. Why? Because if I need to be guaranteed that you're going to hold up your end of the deal. And you better be guaranteed that I'm going to hold up my end of the deal. And if you don't, then because of all these beautiful signatures for miles and miles and miles, I can now get authorities and lawyers and judges involved to make sure that you hold up your end of the deal. That's today's world. That's how we that's how we cut a deal. Well, back then, let's go all the way back, to, time period of Genesis. What don't they have? They don't have cops. They don't have lawyers. They don't have authorities. They don't have judges. They don't have pens. They don't have paper. This is real. So if somebody's trying to get 5 goats for my 2 heifers, how are we going to do it? How are we going to make sure that they hold up their end of the deal? Here's how you do it. You would make what's called a covenant. Ooh, Joseph, I just thought you were talking about random deals. I had no idea where you were going. Covenant, you'd make a covenant. And one of the most popular covenants in the time of Genesis went like this. You would take an animal. This signifies an animal. And this is about to get grotesque, but we're going to move past the weird parts because this is 4,000, 5,000 years ago. We're going to move past some of the weird parts to try and get what was really happening and what God was trying to portray to the people of their day. So here's what they would do. You'd take an animal and you'd cut it in half. Thank you. And you'd have this animal, he's cut in half. And you take another person, Matt, come run up here real fast. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Don't act like you're sore from soccer. I knew you would be. That's why I was like, let's watch him jump, everybody. This man played an indoor soccer game last week, and I knew his calves would barely be able to make it over the top. Okay. What's that sticker there? Okay. We'd cut this animal in half. And then we'd both walk through it around at the same time. And as we did, we'd say, you're going to read these words out with me, right? Put them up. Go ahead, put them up. Yep. Yep. May I become like these. Oh, we got to walk and read. Can you do that? Okay. He goes, no. Okay, you ready? May I become like these animals if I fail to uphold my end of the covenant. Go ahead, take a seat. I can't jump. And now my 5 goats are going to end up in Matt's yard and his 2 heifers are ended up in my yard. That's how you'd make a deal. Now that you know the there and then, and that's the standard way of Abraham's world, now let's walk into Genesis 15. And I'm going to summarize a story. You can go read it later for yourself, but I'm going to summarize it really fast. God shows up and tells Abraham, I'm going to bless you. And because I'm going to bless you, you're going to be a blessing. Yes, we're learning something. If nothing else, we're going to learn that sentence. That's going to be awesome. That's still a long ways. That's a lot more than a lot of churches. Okay. No, never mind. Okay. God shows up and tells Abraham, I'm going to bless you. You're going to be turned into a blessing. Again, by the way, let's just pause for a moment. This is radical behavior from a God. This is completely fresh. This is wild and out. Why is a God coming to a human and saying, I have something good for you, and the human's done nothing for the God yet? Aren't humans supposed to go to gods, make a bunch of sacrifice, and then just barely get enough crops to survive for the next year? Yes. This is completely turned upside down. This is how good this God is from the get-go. a God who wants to do good for a person. And Abraham, by the way, he believes it. This is also revolutionary. He trusts it. By the way, it says that God credits his sheer belief of God's goodness as righteousness. Just belief made Abraham righteous in God's eyes. Hold on to that thought because we're coming way back to that way later. God then tells Abraham he's going to give Abraham a bunch of descendants and a bunch of land. Everybody say descendants. Everybody say land. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Abraham pretty much tells God, hey, I'm good with this. I believe you, but I should probably let you in on a couple pretty big issues with your plan. And God's like, well, what are they? And he goes, I have no land and I have no kids. So we kind of have a big issue here. God ultimately says, don't worry, I got you. I'll take care of it. Abraham then asks this question, how can I know this will happen? And God responds, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram. I hope you know where this is going. Because the next verse reads this. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite of each other. How does this happen? God didn't detail to Abraham what to do. God just knew Abraham's world. And how come God doesn't have to tell Abraham what to do with the animals? Because Abraham already knows what to do because of the world he's living in. He understands the moment God says, bring me these things, he goes, whoa, me and this God are entering into a covenant. In other words, we're cutting a deal. And so Abraham does what people in his day did in situations like this. Then God tells Abraham all sorts of things that are going to happen to his people, but then something wild happens. This is crazy. This is crazy. Abraham falls asleep. They cut the animals in half, and then he walks over and he falls into a deep sleep. Now, if you were listening to the story in that day and age, why would you be confused or freaking out? They didn't make the deal yet. They haven't walked through the middle. They didn't say any of the magic words, and Abraham's sleeping. Like, Abraham, you were this close to a really good God who was going to give you a bunch of land and a bunch of kids, and you fell asleep on the job, bro. It's this moment where you're like reading, you're like, you have one job. That's what's going on. And so instead, Abraham falls asleep, and it says he wakes up and watch what he watches, or what he sees is, this is a smoking fire pot. It's really just a scented candle, but we're going to picture this as a smoking fire pot. Put the verse up, Genesis 15:17. It says, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And pretty much everybody other than our Bible scholar up front is completely confused. And here's the crazy part of this story. Then God tells Abraham a couple more things, and then the story ends. Done. It's like they just dropped us on a cliff and dropped us off, and most of us just skip that part because we're like, I don't know, God, Abraham cut a heifer in piece, a smoking pot walked through. What are we talking about pot? We talking about weed? What are we talking about here? Like, I don't know. Let's move to Genesis 16. That's how most of us read it. But if you understood what's going on, it's actually crazy. And if you start to ask some questions like, wait, what? That's the end of the story? A smoking fire pot passes between the halves of the animal. What's the deal with the smoking fire pot? We should ask that. And here's what I want you to know. The smoking fire pot is a sign of the presence of God. So all that is a picture of God walking through two animals. So that's what you say. So God passed through animals alone? Yes. And as the reader, we should then ask, wait a second, what's going on? If God and Abraham are making a covenant or cutting a deal, why doesn't Abraham pass through the animals? Isn't that how it happens? Isn't that what it took to cut a deal? Didn't both parties agree to do their both parts, right? That's how it worked, right? And you would be right. That's exactly how it worked. And that's the power of this story. Because in this story, God is the only one who passes through. The story starts with something familiar to the people of their time, their day, and their age, but then it takes this wildly unexpected turn at the very end. And that unexpected turn is meant to illustrate to us just how different this God is. He's not only different in Genesis 3, he's not only different in Genesis 5, he's not only different in Genesis 10, he's super different in Genesis 15 with this deal with Abraham. Because what's the point? The point is that at the very beginning, even in this story with Abraham, what happens is this: God commits to upholding both ends of the deal. God says, even if Abraham fails to do his part, I will be faithful. In fact, he goes, I've already tried it with Adam and Eve. I tried it with Noah. There was a whole Tower of Babel thing that happened. Y'all, 3 strikes and you're out. Here's the deal. This time, I'm going to set it up differently. I don't need anything from y'all. I'm not requiring anything from y'all. There's no sacrifice. There's no list of decrees. There's no king. There's no priest. There's no judge. There's nothing that you can do that will actually handle this. So let me just do this. You go to sleep over here. You go rest for a while. I'm going to figure this out. I'll take both parts of the deal, and I'll come bring this to fruition. From the get-go, you won't be able to hold up your end of the bargain, so I'll do it. This was a different type of God that had ever been heard of before. This is what drew people to him. This is why the stories kept getting written. This is why the stories kept getting told and passed down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Because it was, yeah, you could serve Baal, you could serve Ashtoreth, you could serve Asherah, and they'll require everything. They'll give you almost nothing. Or you could serve this God, and he just wants to give us this blessing that's meant to bless others. And guess what he's requiring? What? Nothing. The main forefather fell asleep in the middle of the deal. That's how good he is. Somebody. Now fast forward. Now we're going to hit the fast forward button. We're going to get to this New Testament stuff that we've been wanting to get to forever. Fast forward from Adam and Eve to Abraham to Moses through judges, kings, and prophets. Go from the garden to Egypt to Sinai, Jerusalem, and end up all the way back to Babylon. We have found that through every mess, everybody say mess. Every mess humankind has made, and all the violence, all the sin, all the error we have shown throughout the thousands of years, God still has remained faithful. In other words, he did it. He's been doing his part and our part. He's remained good to us. He's remained faithful and true to his promise. He has continued to contend for us and on our behalf through it all. He continued to do his part and our part as we continue to over and over and over and over again just mess it up. We tried it with kings, screwed it up. Tried it with prophets, screwed it up. Tried it with temples, screwed it up. Tried it with rituals, screwed it up. Tried it with sacrifices, screwed it up. We just kept messing it up, and God kept showing up. Now, most of the Old Testament, though, or a lot of the Old Testament, is dealing improperly toward one another, right? This is the ultimate mess we're making. We're the bearers of violence toward one another, which gives us this awesome, or that's what we've been doing. We've been conquering each other's lands. We've been stealing and pillaging from one another. We've been killing each other's children. We've been doing all this. We covered that cycle last week, but there was one final act. There's one final layer of dirt, right? Because up until this point, we could have still blamed each other. Up until this point, we could have said, yeah, but they attacked me first, so I had to. Or it was either me or them, God, so I chose me and my family. It was all the way back to the garden, right? No, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was Eve. No, it wasn't me. It was the snake. No, it wasn't. The snake had nowhere to turn, so he got cursed. But we've been able to blame it. So there's one final act. There's one final layer of dirt. There's one final layer of the deal. What would happen if God himself showed up on earth and he began to reveal and to give his goodness to us in human flesh? Turn the page, enter Jesus. Jesus shows up. And what does Jesus do from the get-go? He shows up and he starts illustrating to us the goodness of God. He tells us about the love of the Father. In Luke 15, you got a lost coin, you got a lost sheep, you've got a lost son. And all of these stories show us how the love of the Father will pursue us and they will wait for us to no end. In fact, the prodigal son in Luke 15 is so low in life that it tells us he starts eating from the pig food. What a mess. He finally thinks to himself, well, at least I could go to my father's house and I could become a servant. In other words, because of I'll go try to cut with the father. And the father sees the son from a distance and immediately runs to him. Get this, he rejects his deal and he looks at his mess and he throws a robe over top of it. That's his first act. Let me cover that mess. Forget the deal, cover the mess. He gives him a robe, sandals, and a ring. These three things symbolize the immediate covering of all past mistakes. They symbolize identity as a son restored, and it symbolizes his status reinstated with the ring. Jesus told the gospel like this in so many ways. And then he told whoever would listen, go do likewise for everybody else you know. Give them this free illustration of grace. But Jesus didn't only tell us about the love of the Father, he showed us what it looked like. Jesus heals blind men who can't repay him. Jesus frees women from what's holding them bondage, and then he releases them to be preachers in their own town. Jesus goes to people's houses and he eats with the so-called wicked and the outcasts of his day, and he offers them salvation, and all of it seemingly for free. It's amazing. It's so radical. It's so wild. And the powers that were hated him for it. Make no mistake though, remember, as humans, up until this point, we have been making a mess of things. But up until this point, we could blame our messes on the fact that other people were involved. It was technically the other person's fault. Right back to the garden, right? But now, watch, that equation is about to get completely removed. Because the question now becomes, what do we do as humanity with a perfect illustration of God's love and goodness? Remove all potential blame from something else, someone else. Something else didn't do it, someone else didn't do it. We're going to remove all of it with Jesus. So as humans, how do we respond to God's free gift and free expression of grace? Short answer, here's what we do. We as humans ultimately reject Jesus' narrative of who God is. The powers who are, the religious powers who are, they proclaim it as blasphemy. Nope, you got to give a temple tax. Nope, you got to sacrifice this many lambs. Nope, you got to do this. You can't just be walking around here just giving people salvation, Jesus. That ain't how it works. You can't just be giving free grace away. That's not how it works. The gods demand their payment. The political powers viewed it as a threat, right? Because it would have ruined all their organization. But we as humans didn't only reject Jesus' message, we as humans rejected God himself. We as humans, catch it, killed God himself. You want to give us something good for free? You don't want to give me a part in the deal where I have to feel like I did all the work? Where I did something? No. I'm made righteous because of my works. Not on our watch. You're not getting away with something for free and something good for me, not on my watch. So what do? We take a good, loving, perfect, spotless being who is only showing love, grace, and mercy from the Father to us, and we arrested him. We beat him. We blindfolded him. We mocked him after we blindfolded him by hitting him on the head and saying, prophesy, tell us who hit you. We put him on trial. By the way, 2 different people, Pilate and Herod, didn't find any wrong with him. They kept sending him back and forth between each other. But even though they couldn't find any wrong at the highest of heights of the governing sections, do you know what we still yelled? The angry mob still yelled out, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So that's what they did. We whipped him 39 times. We made him carry his own cross. We pinned him to that cross with nails in his hands and feet, and we mocked him some more by putting King of the Jews over the top of his head. We stabbed him in the side with a spear to completely make sure we had finished the job. And by the way, this is the act that on Friday we're going to call Good Friday. But I want you to see something very clearly, because I want you to notice this isn't just any other mess anymore. This isn't only violence or harm against fellow humans now, even though that's bad enough in God's eyes. Now this is violence, and it's at its worst level against God himself. This is the ultimate mess. We have now used God's blessing, his creation of us, not only to do harm to one another, but to do violence against God himself. Our creator has now been killed by his creation. And in the midst of the worst mess that we possibly could have created, in fact, the one moment where God really had every right to say, forget the deal. I'm not staying true with this anymore. In fact, he could have looked at the creation and said, it's no longer my favorite creation. Arguably, this is my most tragic creation. And in that moment, God in the flesh, in the form of Jesus Christ, hangs on that cross as we're torturing him, and he cries out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In the midst of us torturing God, he chose to still show us love. This love was shown to us with Adam and Eve. It wasn't just a New Testament, new revelation. It had been going on for millennia. God showed us it in the deal with Abraham, through Moses, through judges, through kings and prophets, from the garden to Egypt to Sinai to Jerusalem, and all the way through Babylon and into Jesus' life. And while Jesus is hanging on a cross, he shows us the ultimate power of God's love by still choosing love for us over hate toward us. In the midst of our biggest mess. And that, hopefully, should bring us to this final question today, where it meets its head with our lives in this moment. The final question is, what's my part of the deal then? If that's what he's done for me, then what's my part of the deal? How do I get in on this good of a God? How do I do it? John tells us in John chapter 3, verse 16, he says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. What do you have to do? All you have to do is what Abraham did. All you have to do is what the disciples did. All you have to do is believe. All you have to do is believe that God really can be that good. That he'll do your part and his part. All you have to do is surrender to him and receive this free gift from God. Here's what you don't do. You do not clean up the mess first. You don't clean up the mess of your life first. Because this God has been showing since the beginning, I'm not afraid of your largest mess. And if I was, and you wanted to get a message across, I would have done it with Jesus on the cross. I would have brought the hellfire then. I would have brought the wrath then. I would have brought the anger then. But I didn't. In the midst of your largest mess, I chose grace. He's done both parts of the deal. Through Jesus on the cross, now forever and evermore, you are covered. All you have to do, acknowledge the mess and believe that he's that good to clean it up. This is good news. Today, right now, right here, this is the invitation. You can have him. You can invite him into your life, and you can invite him to start cleaning up the mess. And the cool part about this is if you get messy again tomorrow, you want to know the awesome part? You go back to him, and you bring him your new mess, and guess what he does? He starts to clean it up all over again. Because his mercies are new every single morning. That's the type of God you have. I mean, it kind of looks and it kind of sounds something like this. My dad was the type of guy who liked to fix things on his own. Like oil changes. Why pay for someone else to do something you could do yourself, right? But he always told us over the course of time, he would always fill up this one tin can with all the leftover oil. And he always told us, hey, just don't go near that one tin can. In fact, it was one of the only things in the whole garage that he told us not to go near. And I was a really good kid. So I didn't. Until that one day that I definitely did. You don't understand though. I was out of the corner of my eye. I could see that shining tin can. Like it was calling to me. It was beckoning to me. It was like, come play with me. And I walked over and I looked into it. And man, it reminded me, it looked all ooey and gooey and slimy and fun. It was black, but it reminded me of some of that Nickelodeon. You know what I'm talking about. That slime. Before I knew it, I was down here. It didn't smell the best, but man, it looked fun. And before I knew it, I had my whole hand all in this oil. And boy, I'm telling you this, I was right. It was ooey and gooey and slimy and fun, and I was playing with it and having the best of time. And then out of nowhere, I remembered the worst thought ever. You know, Dad's coming home. And he could be home any single minute. You know, the pit in my stomach at that point, I was terrified. I'm freaking out at that point. I began to panic. I just knew I had to get out of here, and I had to clean up this mess. I didn't know how big of a mess it was until I pulled my hands and I'm looking down, I'm going, oh boy, I am dead. But I knew I had at least a couple minutes before Dad got home. So I was just like, I just got to clean it up, whatever. I didn't have anything really close nearby, but I knew if I just get it on my clothes, if I just wipe it off, maybe it'll come off. But it really wasn't coming off that well. And then I realized my clothes were a mess, but I knew I'll get those in the washer and dryer before Mom gets home. She'll never know. I looked down at the garage floor and I was like, shoot, my dad keeps this snow nice and clean. I better clean at least some of the garage floor. So I started to get it and I started wiping around, but everything I did actually was just spreading the mess, and now the towel was dirty too. I ran into the house and I got to the bathroom, and I turned the sink on, and I was seeing as I ran into the house, I was tracking oil through the house because it had gotten on my shoes. And then as I turned the sink on, I was like, it was all over the sink. And then I grabbed the towel next to the sink and I tried to start wiping stuff off there, and I was trying everything I could. And I looked down and the whole bathroom was just, there's oil everywhere. And then I heard the worst sound I could have imagined in that moment. The garage door started to open. I was dead. I knew I was dead. I began to cower. And eventually, after a couple moments, I heard the door open. And I heard my dad call out. He said, Joseph, where are you? He knew where I was. There were oil spots all the way through the house. As he made his way to the bathroom, I got lower and lower and lower, expecting what I deserved in that moment. My dad opened the door up. He looked down. So you play with the oil, huh? I did, but I tried to clean it up. I didn't know it was this messy. I didn't know it was going to do this. I tried everything I could. Everything I tried just made the bigger mess. I'm sorry. I'll never forget. My dad walked over. He picked me up. He brought me over to the kitchen. He set me down. When he set me down, he opened the cupboard up and he grabbed this orange tub of soap I had never seen before. He started to put it on my arms, and he rubbed it in, and he turned the sink on in the kitchen, and he put my arms underneath it. And I watched as all this nasty, slimy, ooey, gooey oil washed off of me. In fact, what I watched as my mess disappeared down the drain. And I learned that day that my dad, he had the right stuff for some of my biggest messes. See, if I could preach to you for a moment, if I could talk to you for a moment, this is the condition of the human race. This is your condition. This is my condition. After thousands and thousands and thousands of years of trying, we only made a bigger mess. And with Jesus Christ, we made the greatest, biggest possible mess ever. We killed God himself. And in the midst of our the largest mess we could possibly ever make, God said, I made a deal. I made a covenant with Abraham from the beginning, and I'm going to see it through all the way. In fact, he said, I'm going to choose mercy, grace, and love instead of hate towards you. You could say it this way. Our Father in heaven, he has the right stuff for our biggest messes.